Welcome back to Raven's Library. Get comfortable, because today we are diving into a story with quite possibly the wildest title I have ever read. It involves a grumpy alpha king, a very stressed-out postal worker, and, well, let's just say a mailbox gets turned into a projectile. Now, grab a snack, preferably not a raw side of beef, and let's get started. Sophie's life as a latent wolf in the Moonstone Pack was less about running wild under the moonlight and more about dodging slobber and sorting junk mail. She was the invisible cog in a machine run by alpha hormones and bad tempers. But everyone has a breaking point. For Sophie, it wasn't the low pay, the lack of a wolf spirit, or the fact that her apartment smelled like wet dog every time it rained. It was a rusty, stuck-up metal box and a resignation letter written in crayon. She didn't mean to commit treason. She didn't mean to launch government property at the most dangerous predator on the continent. But when gravity and bad hinges collide, the universe doesn't ask for permission. And neither did the Alpha King's chest. Chapter 1. I paid for overnight shipping on the premium beef jerky, and it arrived lukewarm, Sophie. Lukewarm! Do you know what tepid meat does to my mate's digestion? Sophie stared blankly at Mrs. Higgins, a beta female with a perm that looked like a distressed poodle and breath that smelled suspiciously of raw liver. The Moonstone Pack post office was currently a humid hellscape of cardboard, shedding fur, and unbridled entitlement. It was 3 p.m. Sophie hadn't had a break since dawn, and someone had spilled a bottle of eau de route cologne in the sorting bay, making the entire building smell like a desperate teenager's locker room. "Mrs. Higgins," Sophie said, her voice a flat line of exhausted patience. "You sent the package via Standard Hound. That is a 3 to 5 business day window. The meat was destined to sweat. That's just physics." "Don't you quote physics at me, you wolfless little stray." Mrs. Higgins slammed her hand on the counter, causing a stack of "sorry we missed you" slips to flutter to the floor like tragic confetti. "If you had a wolf, you'd understand the urgency of snacks. But you don't, do you? You just have a clipboard." That was it. The snap was audible, though it didn't come from a bone. It came from the last fraying thread of Sophie's sanity. For 3 years, she had been the punching bag for every wolf who was having a bad fur day. Because she was latent, born with the gene but without the shift, she was technically lower in the hierarchy than the pack's decorative hydrangeas. She inhaled sharply, smelling the dust, the cheap toner, and Mrs. Higgins' indignation, and made a decision that would likely ruin her credit score and her life. "You're right," Sophie said, a terrifyingly calm smile stretching across her face. "I don't understand the urgency of snacks, but I do understand the urgency of exiting this building before I commit a felony with a staple gun." She didn't wait for Mrs. Higgins to gasp. Sophie turned around, grabbed a Sharpie and a crumpled napkin from her lunch, and scribbled 2 words in aggressive block letters. "I quit." She didn't clock out. She didn't say goodbye to her supervisor, a man who spent 90% of his day scratching his ear with a letter opener. She vaulted over the counter, clumsily, catching her foot on a box of priority kibble, and marched out the double doors into the blinding afternoon sun. The fresh air hit her, but it didn't cool her rage. It fueled it. She wasn't just quitting the branch. She was resigning from the whole rotten system. And to do that, she had to deliver her resignation to the top, the royal drop box at the palace gates. The walk to the royal district was a blur of righteous indignation and sweaty palms. The Moonstone Palace loomed over the city like a jagged tooth of obsidian and glass, a monument to Alpha King Remus's power and aesthetic minimalism. It was surrounded by iron gates that cost more than Sophie's entire bloodline, and right in front of those gates stood the bane of her existence, the royal priority mailbox. It was a cast-iron monstrosity painted a deep, arrogant red, emblazoned with the royal crest. It was designed to intimidate. It was designed to say, "Your mail isn't good enough for me." Sophie marched up to it, the napkin clutching in her trembling hand. A couple of palace guards, massive, hulking shifters in tactical gear, glanced at her with bored amusement. They didn't intervene. Who was she? Just a small, frizzy-haired girl in a stained postal uniform engaging in a stare-down with a stationary object. "Okay, you pretender," Sophie muttered to the box. "Take this, and I'm free. I'm moving to the human territories. I'll become a barista. I'll learn to love oat milk." She grabbed the handle of the drop slot. It didn't move. She tugged harder. Stuck. "Oh, come on," she groaned, bracing her foot against the decorative cobblestones. "Don't do this to me. Just eat the napkin." She pulled with both hands. Nothing. The humidity had rusted the hinges shut, or maybe the box just sensed her lack of status and decided to deny her service. A low growl built in her throat, not a wolf growl, just a very human noise of frustration. The guards were definitely watching now, snickering. "Open!" Sophie yelled, abandoning dignity entirely. She turned her hip into the metal, body-checking the cast iron. It rattled, mocking her. "You stubborn, rusty, elitist trash can!" She grabbed the top of the box and shook it. She wasn't strong. She was 5'4" of caffeine and spite. But apparently the post holding the box up had been compromised by years of acidic city rain and male dogs marking their territory. As Sophie gave one final Herculean shove, screaming, "I said I quit!" the metal groaned in surrender. It didn't open. It snapped. The sound was like a gunshot, a sharp crack of sheared metal. Sophie's momentum carried her forward, but the box didn't stay put. It detached completely from its pedestal. Time seemed to slow down. Sophie watched in horror as the heavy iron box left her hands, airborne. It was no longer a receptacle for mail. It was a projectile, an unguided missile of government properties sailing through the air. And directly in its path, stepping out of the pedestrian gate to avoid the paparazzi, was a man. He was tall, absurdly tall. He was wearing a suit that cost more than the gross domestic product of a small country, tailored to fit shoulders that were broad enough to land a helicopter on. He had dark hair, a jawline that could cut glass, and he was currently looking down at his phone, completely unaware that 50 pounds of cast iron was hurtling toward his solar plexus. "Look out!" Sophie shrieked. But it was too late. The box slammed into the man. Sophie squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the sound of breaking ribs, the scream of pain, the wet thud of a body hitting the pavement. She waited for the sirens. She waited for her life to flash before her eyes. But there was no scream. There was just a dull, heavy thud, like a sledgehammer hitting a side of beef, followed by a metallic clank as the box was caught. Caught. Sophie opened one eye, then the other. Her breath hitched in her throat, strangling a squeak of terror. The man hadn't fallen. He hadn't even stumbled. He stood rooted to the spot, one massive hand wrapped around the dented metal of the mailbox, holding it effortless inches from his chest. The other hand was still holding his phone. He slowly lowered the device, slipping it into his pocket with a grace that was terrifyingly predatory, and raised his head. Eyes the color of molten gold locked onto hers. They weren't human eyes. They were the eyes of a wolf looking at a rabbit that had just made a very, very fatal error. Silence descended on the street. The birds stopped singing. The traffic seemed to mute itself out of respect for the impending violence. Even the guards had frozen, their jaws hanging open, looking between Sophie and the man holding the mailbox. Sophie recognized him. Of course she did. His face was on the stamps she licked every day. Alpha King Remus, the apex. The man who reportedly ate rogue wolves for breakfast and used their bones as toothpicks. And she had just thrown a mailbox at him. Remus stared at her. He didn't blink. He took a slow, deep breath, his nostrils flaring as he inhaled the scent of her fear, her cheap shampoo, and the lingering odor of the post office. A strange expression flickered across his face. Annoyance? Anger? Hunger? Before settling into a mask of stony, terrifying calm. He looked down at the mailbox in his hand, inspecting the Royal Priority logo, which was now crumpled inward, then looked back at Sophie, who was currently trembling so hard her knees were knocking together audibly. He took a step toward her. The crowd that had gathered parted like the Red Sea. Sophie wanted to run, but her feet were cemented to the pavement. Remus stopped inches from her. He towered over her, blocking out the sun, plunging her into his shadow. He smelled like cedar, rain, and a power so thick it made the air crackle with static. He leaned down, bringing his face level with hers. His voice, when it came, was a low, vibrating rumble that traveled through the floor and straight up Sophie's spine, making her insides liquefy. "You have a terrible aim, little wolf," he murmured, his golden eyes dancing with a light she couldn't interpret. "But excellent delivery." Sophie opened her mouth to apologize, to beg for mercy, to offer him a coupon for express shipping. But no words came out. Remus straightened up, tucked the crushed mailbox under his arm like a clutch purse, and signaled to his guards. "Seize her," he commanded, though his eyes never left her face. "She's under arrest for assaulting the crown." As the guards grabbed Sophie's arms, Remus turned back, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips as he delivered the final blow. "Wait," he growled, holding up a hand. The guards froze. Remus looked Sophie up and down, his gaze lingering on her name tag. "Actually, Howl did." Chapter 2. The silence that followed the king's pun was heavier than the cast-iron box tucked under his arm. It wasn't the kind of silence that commanded respect. It was the kind of silence where 50 people collectively wondered if they were hallucinating. "Howled it?" Sophie whispered, her voice cracking. "Did you just make a pun while arresting me?" Remus didn't answer. He simply turned on his heel, the movement fluid and terrifyingly graceful, and began walking back toward the palace gates. The guards, snapping out of their stupor, gripped Sophie's arms tighter. They didn't drag her, exactly, but they certainly provided a level of motivation that made her feet move faster than her brain could process. "Wait! I have rights!" Sophie stammered as she was hustled past the security checkpoint. "I demand a union representative. I demand to speak to the Postmaster General. That box was structurally unsound. It was a hazard." "Silence, prisoner," the guard on her left grunted. He smelled like wet dog and indifference. They passed through the massive obsidian gates, leaving the whispering crowd and the flashing cameras behind. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs, like a bird trapped in a shoebox. She had been to the palace delivery bay 1,000 times, a gray concrete loading dock that smelled of exhaust fumes, but she had never been through the front door. The main foyer was an assault on the senses. It was vast, with floors made of polished black marble that reflected the terrified expression on her face. The air was cool and smelled of ozone and expensive flowers, but mostly, it smelled of him, the king. His scent was everywhere here, a heavy, woodsy musk that made the hair on Sophie's arm stand up. It was the scent of an apex predator, one that triggered a primal instinct in her latent DNA. Submit. Sophie fought the urge to drop to her knees. She focused on the back of Remus's suit jacket instead. It was unwrinkled. How was it unwrinkled? She had just hit him with a 50-pound government projectile, and he looked like he was walking down a runway. Remus didn't lead them to the dungeons. He walked past the elevators that led to the lower levels, past the security station, and straight toward the private, gold-plated elevator reserved for the royal family. Excuse me," Sophie squeaked as the guards deposited her into the elevator car. Remus stepped in after her, the doors sliding shut with a soft whoosh, sealing them in a box much smaller and more intimate than the foyer. "I think there's been a mistake. The dungeons are down. Unless you have a sky dungeon? Is that a thing? Do you drop people from a height?" Remus finally looked at her. In the confined space, he was overwhelming. He seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the air. He placed the dented mailbox on the velvet bench at the back of the elevator and turned his golden gaze on her. He wasn't smiling, but the corners of his eyes crinkled with something that looked dangerously like amusement. "The dungeons are damp," Remus said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the soles of her shoes. "And they smell of mildew. I have sensitive sinuses." "So, you're executing me in the penthouse?" Sophie asked, clutching her bag to her chest. "For hygiene reasons?" Remus took a step closer. Sophie backed up until her shoulder blades hit the mirrored wall. He placed one hand on the wall beside her head, boxing her in. Up close, his eyes were a swirling nebula of gold and amber. He leaned down, inhaling sharply near her neck. Sophie stopped breathing. "You smell," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "of cheap coffee and ink." It's a lifestyle choice," she breathed. "And," he continued, ignoring her, "you smell like frustration. Why were you trying to quit, little wolf?" "I'm not a wolf," Sophie blurted out, the old insecurity flaring up even in the face of death. "I'm latent, and I was quitting because the system is broken, and Mrs. Higgins is a nightmare, and your mailbox has a rusted hinge." The elevator chimed softly. The doors opened. "The mailbox," Remus said, pulling back and straightening his tie, "was a 17th century antique commissioned by my great-grandfather. It is irreplaceable." He gestured for her to exit. "Welcome to your new cell." Chapter 3. Sophie stepped out of the elevator and onto a carpet so plush it felt like walking on a cloud made of sheep. This was not a cell. This was the royal penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the entire city, currently bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. There was a fireplace large enough to roast an ox, a sectional sofa that could seat a small army, and a kitchen that gleamed with chrome and marble. This is... Sophie spun around, looking for the bars, the shackles, the torture devices. Where are the guards? Dismissed, Remus said, walking past her to a massive mahogany desk that dominated the far corner of the room. He placed the dented mailbox on the desk with a heavy thud, treating it like a paperweight. I don't need guards to keep a 5'4" postal clerk from escaping. Where would you go? The elevator requires a biometric scan. The windows are reinforced glass. And he unbuttoned his suit jacket and tossed it onto a chair, am faster than you. Sophie swallowed. He was right. He was the Alpha King. He could probably catch her before she even thought about running. So what happens now? Sophie asked, trying to summon a scrap of bravado. Do I get a lawyer? A trial? A last meal? You have a debt to pay, Remus said, sitting down in his leather chair and steepling his fingers. He looked like a Bond villain, if Bond villains were unnervingly attractive werewolves. That mailbox is state property. The damage you caused, to the box, to the pavement, and to my suit lining, is substantial. I estimate the cost at roughly 5 years of your current salary. Sophie's jaw dropped. 5 years? For a dent? I can buff it out. I have a very aggressive sponge at home. The debt must be worked off, Remus declared, ignoring her offer of the sponge. Since you were so eager to resign from the public branch, you are hereby reassigned. Effective immediately, you are the royal courier. The what? My personal courier, Remus clarified. He picked up a sleek black pen and twirled it between his fingers. My correspondence is sensitive. I cannot trust it to just anyone. I need someone who is passionate, someone willing to use physical force to ensure delivery, someone who throws heavy objects when dissatisfied. I was having a bad day, Sophie protested. I'm not violent. I'm administrative. You will live here, Remus continued, steamrolling over her objection. He pointed to a door on the left. That is the guest suite. You will sort, screen, and hand-deliver every piece of mail that enters this office. If a single letter is lost, late, or crinkled, the sentence extends. Live here? Sophie looked at the door, then back at him. With you? In the penthouse? People will talk. The tabloids will have a field day. King holds postal worker hostage in luxury sky prison. Remus stood up. He walked around the desk, closing the distance between them again. The playful glint was gone, replaced by something heavier, more intense. Let them talk, he growled softly. You are under my protection now, Sophie. No one touches you. No one yells at you about beef jerky. You belong to the crown. He paused, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before snapping back to her eyes. Now go to your room. Dinner is at 8. Don't be late. I hate eating alone. Chapter 4. The next morning, Sophie discovered that Royal Courier came with a uniform. It was laid out on the end of her king-sized bed, which was roughly the size of her entire old apartment. It wasn't the stained blue polyester of the public branch. It was a tailored charcoal pencil skirt, a crisp white blouse made of silk, and a fitted vest embroidered with the golden wolf crest. It was professional, sharp, and, unfortunately, fit her curves like a second skin. Ridiculous, Sophie muttered, pulling on the vest. I look like a flight attendant for a werewolf airline. She marched out into the main living area. Remus was already at his desk, surrounded by mountains of paperwork. He looked up as she entered, his pen freezing mid-signature. His nostrils flared slightly, inhaling her scent. "Acceptable," he said gruffly, looking back down at his papers. "Your station is over there." He pointed to a smaller, elegant desk set up perpendicular to his. It was piled high with envelopes, packages, and scrolls. "Fine," Sophie said, smoothing her skirt. "I will be the best courier you've ever seen. I will sort this mail so hard you won't know what hit you." Metaphorically. She sat down and began to work. She was good at this. She organized by priority, by sender, by scent. Some envelopes smelled like perfume, others like fear. An hour later, she stood up, holding a silver tray with the urgent stack. She walked over to Remus's desk. "Your Majesty, priority correspondence from the Northern Alpha and the Council of Elders." Remus didn't look up. He reached out a hand. Sophie extended the tray. His fingers brushed against hers as he took the top envelope. Zap! A spark of static electricity, loud and sharp, snapped between them. Sophie yanked her hand back with a gasp. Remus dropped the envelope. They stared at each other. The air in the room suddenly felt thick, charged with invisible energy. "Carpet," Sophie said quickly, rubbing her hand. "Static, high altitude, it's physics." Remus looked at his hand, then at her. His pupils were blown wide, swallowing the gold. He picked up the envelope, sniffed it, and then tossed it into the trash can without opening it. "Junk," he said. "That was from the Northern Alpha," Sophie exclaimed. "It had a wax seal." "I didn't like the tone," Remus said. He held out his hand again. "Next." Sophie handed him the next letter. Again, their fingers brushed. Zap! Remus inhaled sharply. He took the letter, held it for a moment, and tossed it in the trash. Junk. "That was a tax bill." "Boring." He extended his hand again, his eyes locked on hers with a predatory intensity. "Next." Sophie realized, with a jolt of horror and something else, something warm and fluttering in her stomach, that he wasn't reading the mail. He didn't care about the mail. He just wanted to touch her hand. "You," Sophie said, clutching the tray against her chest, "are inefficient." "And you," Remus rumbled, leaning back in his chair, "are turning red. Are you running a fever, courier? Or is the room getting hot?" Chapter 5. By day 3, Sophie had established a rhythm. Wake up, put on the silk uniform, argue with the king about what constituted junk mail, and try to ignore the fact that every time he looked at her, she felt like she was being hunted in the most pleasant way possible. She was currently arguing with him about a petition from the sheep farmers when the elevator doors chimed. Sophie didn't look up. "If this is the caterer, tell them the king refuses to eat anything that was once a root vegetable." "It is not the caterer." A cool, sharp voice sliced through the room. Sophie froze. She looked up to see a woman standing in the elevator entrance. She was stunning. Tall, blonde, with legs that went on for days and a gaze that could freeze water. She was wearing a dress that cost more than Sophie's life insurance policy. Lady Vanessa, the daughter of the head councilman, the woman every tabloid said was destined to be Remus's queen. Vanessa looked at Sophie, her lip curling in a sneer of absolute disgust. She didn't see a person. She saw a stain on the carpet. "Remus," Vanessa said, sweeping into the room and ignoring Sophie entirely. "I didn't realize you had hired domestic help. I thought the cleaning crew came at night." Remus didn't look up from his file, but his shoulders stiffened. "Sophie is my courier, Vanessa, not the help." courier. Vanessa laughed, a harsh, barking sound. You have a latent mouse-sorting state secrets? Darling, really, it's embarrassing. Send her to fetch me a latte, and then we can talk about the winter ball. She dropped her designer handbag onto Sophie's desk, right on top of a stack of organized treaties. Chop chop, little mouse, Vanessa snapped, snapping her fingers at Sophie. Oat milk, no foam. Sophie looked at the handbag. She looked at Vanessa's perfectly manicured nails. Then she looked at the Postal Regulations handbook she had memorized out of boredom. I'm afraid I can't do that, Sophie said, her voice steady despite the shaking of her hands. Vanessa blinked. Excuse me? Postal Code 4, Section 12, Sophie recited, standing up. A royal courier is prohibited from handling unauthorized biological fluids or food products while on duty. Furthermore, interfering with the sorting of royal correspondence is a federal offense. She poked the handbag with a pen. Move your bag. You are obstructing the flow of government business. Vanessa's face turned a violent shade of red. Her eyes flashed, her wolf surfacing. She took a step toward Sophie, claws extending. You insolent little! A low, thunderous growl shook the room. The windows rattled in their frames. Vanessa froze. Sophie froze. Remus was standing. He wasn't just standing. He was looming. His chair had been knocked over. His eyes were glowing solid gold, and his lips were pulled back to reveal lethal canines. He wasn't looking at Sophie. He was looking at Vanessa with cold, unbridled fury. She told you. Remus snarled, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. To move the bag. Remus! Vanessa gasped, retreating a step. I was just... You insulted my staff, Remus said, stepping around the desk. He moved between Sophie and Vanessa, a living shield of muscle and rage. You insulted her. Get out, before I forget that I am a gentleman, and remember that I am a wolf. Vanessa snatched her bag and fled to the elevator, hammering the button. The doors closed on her terrified face. The room fell silent. Sophie stared at Remus's back. He was breathing hard, his hands clenched into fists. He had defended her. The king had growled at a high-born alpha for her. You... Sophie started, reaching out a hand. Suddenly, a siren began to wail. A red light started flashing above the elevator. A mechanical voice echoed through the penthouse. Security alert. Storm protocol initiated. Full lockdown engaged. Massive steel shutters began to slam down over the floor-to-ceiling windows, plunging the room into darkness. The power cut. Remus? Sophie whispered into the dark. Stay close. Remus's voice came from right beside her ear, rough and strained. The lockdown seals the airlocks. We are trapped until the storm passes. Sophie reached out and felt his arm. It was rock hard and trembling. Are you okay? She asked. No, he rasped. My wolf does not like cages. The darkness was absolute. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was a physical weight, heavy and suffocating, pressing against Sophie's eardrums. The mechanical hum of the emergency shutters sealing the penthouse had died away, leaving only the sound of ragged, harsh breathing that definitely wasn't hers. Remus? Sophie whispered, holding her hands out like a mime in a box. Remus, say something. Preferably something that isn't a growl, because frankly, the acoustics in here are terrifying. There was no answer, only a low, vibrating thrum that seemed to come from the corner where the floor-to-ceiling window used to be. It sounded like a chainsaw idling inside a chest of drawers. Sophie took a step forward and immediately cracked her shin against the solid mahogany coffee table. "Mother of—" she hissed, hopping on one foot. "Okay, furniture is lethal. Noted." "Stay back." Remus's voice tore through the dark. It was strained, guttural, barely human. It sounded like rocks grinding together. "My wolf. The containment. He thinks we are buried." Claustrophobia. Of course. The Alpha King, the ruler of the open wilds, was trapped in a steel box. "We aren't buried," Sophie said, forcing her voice to be steady, channeling the same tone she used on customers who claimed their package was stolen when it was clearly sitting on their porch. "We are in a very expensive panic room. It's just a storm, Remus. The generators will kick in any second." "No generators," Remus rasped. "Total lockdown. Sabotage protocol. We are sealed until the threat clears." A loud crack echoed through the room, the sound of wood splintering. He was destroying the furniture. Sophie realized with a jolt of ice-cold fear that she was locked in a pitch-black room with an apex predator who was losing his mind. If she stayed back, he might tear the room apart until he hurt himself, or her. She didn't stay back. She moved. Guided by the sound of his breathing, she navigated the minefield of luxury decor. She reached the far wall, her fingers brushing against the cold steel of the shutters. The growling was right next to her now, loud enough to rattle her teeth. "Remus?" she said softly. A hand shot out of the darkness, large and hot, gripping her wrist. It wasn't gentle, but it didn't break bone. He pulled her forward with a jerk, and Sophie stumbled, falling to her knees on the thick carpet. She collided with a wall of solid muscle. He was on the floor, his back against the shutters, vibrating with tension. "I told you," he snarled, his face inches from hers, his eyes glowing like two burning coals in the void, "to stay back." "I have a problem with authority," Sophie whispered, her heart hammering against his chest. "And you're hyperventilating. You need to ground yourself." "I need out," he gasped, his claws digging into the carpet. "You can't get out," Sophie said firmly. She reached up, risking her fingers, and placed both hands on his face. His skin was burning up. "So you have to be here, with me. Focus on me, Remus, not the walls, just me." He froze at her touch. The growl caught in his throat. He leaned into her palms, desperate for the contact, for something real in the suffocating dark. "Sophie," he breathed, and the name sounded like a prayer. "I'm here," she soothed, stroking her thumbs over his cheekbones. "I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere, mostly because I can't find the door, but also because I'm not leaving you." Chapter 7. Remus didn't let go. In fact, he did the opposite. He maneuvered her until she was sitting between his legs, her back pressed against his chest, his arms wrapped around her like iron bands. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling so deeply she felt the air rush past her skin. Better? Sophie asked, her voice trembling slightly. You smell like rain, he mumbled against her pulse point. And ink. And cheap synthetic fabric. It's the uniform you chose, Sophie retorted, though she didn't try to move. She felt safe. It was insane, but wrapped in the arms of a near-feral werewolf in the pitch black, she felt safer than she ever had in her lonely apartment. If you want me to smell like silk, give me a raise. Done, he rumbled. The vibration traveled through her back, loosening the knot of tension in her spine. They sat in silence for a long time. The air in the room grew warmer, heavy with his scent, cedar, ozone, and that deep, masculine musk that made Sophie's latent biology hum with awareness. Why are you latent? Remus asked quietly. The question wasn't an accusation, it was genuine curiosity. Genetics, I guess? Sophie shrugged, the movement rubbing her shoulder against his chest. My parents were both betas. When I didn't shift at 16, they didn't kick me out, but they stopped setting a place for me at the pack dinners. I became invisible. Remus's arms tightened around her, his grip possessive. You are not invisible. I was until I threw a mailbox at you, she joked weakly. No, Remus said, and he sounded incredibly lucid now. I saw you before that. 3 months ago. You were delivering a package to the gate guards. You were wearing a yellow scarf. You laughed at something one of them said. I watched you from the balcony. Sophie twisted in his arms, trying to see his face in the dark. You saw me? I see everything in my territory, Remus whispered. He nuzzled her ear, his nose cold against her skin. But I didn't smell you until the box broke. That's when I knew. Knew what? He didn't answer. Instead, he did something that short-circuited Sophie's brain. He licked the sensitive spot right under her ear. It wasn't a human kiss. It was a mark, a claim. Remus, she gasped. Sleep, Sophie, he commanded softly, resting his chin on top of her head. The storm will last all night. You are safe in the dark. I can see for both of us. Sophie wanted to argue. She wanted to ask what he meant, but the heat radiating from him was a narcotic. Her eyelids felt heavy. Her body, exhausted from the adrenaline, melted against him. Okay, she whispered, but if you eat me while I'm sleeping, I'm going to be very upset. I would never eat you, Remus murmured, his voice fading into the darkness, though I am tempted to bite. Light hit Sophie's face like a physical slap. She groaned, trying to roll over and pull the covers up, but she couldn't move. She was pinned. She blinked her eyes open. The shutters were gone. The morning sun was streaming through the windows, illuminating the wreckage of the penthouse living room. The coffee table was splintered. A vase was shattered. And she was lying on the floor, curled up on a makeshift nest of throw pillows and suit jackets? She looked down. She was wearing Remus's suit jacket over her uniform, and Remus was asleep next to her, his arm thrown heavily over her waist, his face buried in her hair. He looked younger when he slept, less terrifying. His eyelashes were ridiculously long. Oh no, Sophie whispered. This is bad. This is HR nightmare bad. The elevator chimed. Sophie froze. Remus's eyes snapped open instantly. They weren't sleepy. They were golden and alert. The elevator doors slid open. Standing there was not the maid. It was Councilman Conry, Lady Vanessa's father, and 2 other stony-faced elders. They looked at the destroyed room. They looked at Sophie, disheveled and wearing the king's jacket. They looked at the king, lying on the floor with a postal clerk. Your Majesty, Councilman Conry said, his voice dripping with judgment. "We were concerned when the security protocol engaged. We see you were occupied." Remus sat up slowly. He didn't scramble. He didn't look embarrassed. He sat up with the languid grace of a lion disturbed by gnats. He pulled Sophie up with him, keeping a hand firmly on her lower back. "The system malfunctioned," Remus said coolly. "We were trapped." "Evidently," Conry sneered. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a piece of paper. "While you were nesting, with the help, the council convened. We have assessed the damages from the incident 2 days ago. The mailbox, the pavement, the emotional distress to the public." He walked forward and thrust the paper at Remus. "A bill of restitution," Conry announced, "and a formal request for the termination of this employee. She is a liability." Sophie peeked at the paper. The number had so many zeros it looked like binary code. "You want me to pay 2 million credits?" Sophie squeaked. "For a mailbox? Does it grant wishes?" "It is a historical artifact," Conry thundered. Remus took the paper. He looked at it. He looked at Conry. Then he opened his mouth and bit the paper. He didn't tear it. He literally took a bite out of the heavy cardstock, chewed it slowly while maintaining unblinking eye contact with Conry, and swallowed. "Insufficient postage," Remus said. Conry turned purple. You just ate a council decree." "It needed salt," Remus noted dryly. He stood up, pulling Sophie with him. He towered over the councilman. "Sophie stays. She is working off her debt, and if you attempt to fine her again, I will assume the council has too much funding, and I will adjust the budget downward, drastically." He leaned in, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Get out of my living room." Chapter 9. The victory over the council was sweet, but short-lived. By noon, reality had set in. Remus had meetings, endless, boring meetings about territory lines and grain imports, and Sophie had a job to do. "I need this delivered to the Western Outpost," Remus said, handing her a sealed leather pouch. He wouldn't look at her. He had been distant since the eating the paper incident, as if he realized he had shown too much possessiveness. "It is a diplomatic scroll. It cannot be sent electronically. It must be hand-delivered." "The Western Outpost?" Sophie frowned. "That's at the edge of the Packlands. It's a 2-hour drive." "My driver is waiting downstairs," Remus said, finally glancing at her. His eyes were dark, conflicted. "Go. Come back straight away. Do not stop for snacks." "Aye, aye, Captain." Sophie saluted, trying to lighten the mood. She grabbed her heavy leather satchel, which she had filled with extra water bottles and a stapler because old habits died hard, and headed for the door. The drive was uneventful, but as they neared the edge of the territory, the woods grew thicker, darker. The driver, a silent beta named Lyle, pulled the sleek black SUV over on a deserted stretch of road, surrounded by dense pines. "Roadblock ahead, miss," Lyle said. "Tree down. I have to check it." He got out. Sophie watched him walk toward the fallen tree. He stopped, looked around, and then, to her horror, he shifted into a wolf and ran. He ran away from the car, leaving her there. "Lyle?" Sophie rolled down the window. "Hey! You forgot the passenger!" A twig snapped in the woods to her right, then another to her left. Sophie knew that sound. She was latent, but she grew up around wolves. That was the sound of a hunting party coordinating a flank. She didn't wait. She grabbed the satchel, shoved the door open, and bolted. She didn't run down the road. She scrambled up the embankment, heading for the denser trees where a car couldn't follow. "Get her!" a voice shouted. It wasn't a growl. It was a man. "The council wants her gone." Rogues. Or worse, hired mercenaries. Sophie's lungs burned. She wasn't an athlete. She was a courier. But couriers knew shortcuts. She vaulted over a log, her foot catching on a root, and tumbled into a small clearing. 3 men stepped out from behind the trees. They were scruffy, smelling of stale beer and violence. Their eyes flashed yellow. "End of the route, male girl," the center one sneered, his hands shifting into claws. Sophie backed up until she hit a tree. She clutched her satchel to her chest. She had no wolf. She had no claws. She had a diplomatic scroll and a heavy-duty stapler. "You know," Sophie panted, her voice shaking but loud, "interfering with a royal courier carries a mandatory prison sentence. It's a federal crime." The rogue laughed. "We aren't here to arrest you, sweetheart. We're here to make you disappear." He lunged. Sophie didn't scream. She reacted with the muscle memory of 3 years of handling heavy packages. She swung the leather satchel with both hands, using the centrifugal force of the water bottles and the solid metal stapler inside. Crack! The bag connected with the rogue's jaw with a sickening thud. He didn't even yelp. He just folded like a lawn chair and hit the dirt, unconscious. The other 2 rogues stopped, staring at their fallen leader. They looked at Sophie. Sophie looked at them, hefting the bag again. "Standard shipping," she snarled, adrenaline flooding her system. "Who wants express?" But even as she raised the bag, she saw 5 more wolves stepping out of the shadows, surrounding the clearing. She was trapped. "Remus!" she screamed in her head, squeezing her eyes shut. "Help!" Chapter 10. The air in the clearing didn't just change, it shattered. One moment, Sophie was brandishing her mailbag like a medieval flail, surrounded by 5 sneering rogues. The next, a sound tore through the forest that vibrated in the marrow of her bones. It wasn't a howl, it was a roar, a sonic boom of pure, unadulterated dominance that flattened the grass and made the leaves rain down from the canopy. The rogues froze, their ears flattening against their skulls. They knew that sound. Every wolf born on this continent knew that sound. It was the sound of the apex. From the tree line, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. It was massive, easily the size of a small horse, with fur as black as a starless night and eyes that burned like molten gold. The king's wolf. He didn't run. He flowed, a blur of lethal kinetic energy. He hit the first rogue with the force of a freight train, sending the body flying into a pine tree with a sickening crunch. The second rogue turned to flee, but the black wolf was already there, snapping a leg with a precision that was almost surgical. Sophie pressed her back against the bark of her tree, clutching her satchel so hard her knuckles turned white. She had seen wolves fight before, usually over parking spots or spilled drinks, but this was different. This was war. This was nature, red in tooth and claw. The remaining 3 rogues scrambled, tripping over themselves to get away, but Remus wasn't letting them leave. He was a hurricane of fur and fangs. Yet in the middle of the carnage, he paused. His massive head swiveled toward Sophie. He looked at her, trembling against the tree. Then his golden gaze dropped to the ground near her feet, to the unconscious rogue she had taken out with the stapler. The giant wolf sniffed the unconscious man. He looked back at Sophie. He chuffed, a low, rhythmic sound deep in his chest. It sounded suspiciously like a laugh, or pride. With the threat neutralized, the conscious rogues had wet themselves and vanished, The black wolf walked toward her. The air shimmered around him, bending and warping, and with a sound of cracking bones that always made Sophie nauseous, the fur receded. Remus stood up. He was breathing hard, a smear of blood on his cheek that wasn't his, and he was completely, gloriously naked. Sophie's eyes widened. She immediately held up the mailbag to cover her face. "Royal protocol! Indecent exposure! I am filing a complaint." "You called me," Remus growled, his voice rough and layered with the echo of his wolf. He ignored her modesty shield, stepping closer until his heat radiated against her skin. He didn't seem to care that he was nude. He wore his power like a suit of armor. "I heard you scream in my head." "I didn't scream," Sophie squeaked from behind the leather bag. "I forcefully requested assistance via telepathic channels." Remus gently hooked a finger over the top of the bag and lowered it. His eyes were wild, his pupils blown wide. He scanned her for injuries, his gaze intense enough to leave burns. "You fought," he murmured, looking at the stapler protruding from her bag. "You defended yourself." "I used the priority mail method," Sophie whispered. "It's very impact-heavy." Remus made a noise that was half groan, half purr. He grabbed her by the waist, lifting her off the ground as if she weighed nothing more than an envelope. "My brave little courier," he rumbled, burying his face in her neck. "Let's get you home. I'm canceling all deliveries." Chapter 11. The ride back to the palace was a blur, mostly because Remus refused to let Sophie sit in a seat. He had summoned a backup car, wrapped a trench coat around himself, to Sophie's mild disappointment, and spent the entire journey with her pulled onto his lap, his nose buried in her hair, inhaling her scent to calm his lingering battle frenzy. When they reached the penthouse, he didn't put her down. He kicked the door open and carried her straight into the bathroom, setting her on the marble vanity. "I need to check for scratches," he announced, turning on the tap and wetting a cloth. "I'm fine, Remus," Sophie argued, though her hands were still shaking from the adrenaline crash. "The only thing that got hurt was my emotional stability and possibly my favorite stapler." "Hold still," he commanded softly. He wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek. His touch was impossibly gentle for a man who had just dismantled a pack of rogues. He moved the cloth down to her neck, then to her collarbone. The water was warm, but his fingers were hotter. The air in the bathroom grew thick and humid. Sophie watched his face, the sharp jawline, the intense focus. The fear of the woods was fading, replaced by a sharp, pulling ache in her stomach. The bond. It was humming between them, a live wire of static electricity. Remus dropped the cloth. He placed his hands on her thighs, his thumbs rubbing circles against the fabric of her skirt. He leaned in, his eyes searching hers. "Sophie," he whispered. "Remus," she breathed back. "If you're going to kiss me, you should probably do it before I start thinking about the HR implications." He growled low in his throat and surged forward. His lips crashed onto hers, hungry and desperate. It wasn't a polite kiss. It was a devouring. Sophie wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, tangling her fingers in his damp hair. She tasted mint and iron and power. He pressed her back against the mirror, his body hard against hers. His hand slid up her thigh, hitching her skirt higher. Sophie gasped, arching into him. Her body was screaming yes. Her latent wolf, usually dormant, was pacing in her mind, scratching at the door. Then, just as his hand reached the waistband of her tights, he froze. He tore his mouth away from hers with a ragged gasp. He rested his forehead against the mirror next to her head, his chest heaving. "No," he rasped, "not like this." Sophie blinked, dazed and swollen-lipped. "Excuse me? I think 'like this' was going very well." Remus pulled back, his eyes dark with frustration, but clear. "You are running on adrenaline. You were almost killed an hour ago. You are reacting to the fear, seeking comfort." He smoothed her skirt down with trembling hands. "I will not take you as a reaction, Sophie. I will not let you wake up tomorrow regretting that you let the alpha claim you because you were scared." "I'm not scared of you," Sophie said, frustration bubbling up, "and I'm perfectly capable of making bad decisions while calm." "I know." Remus gave a strained half-smile, backing away toward the door. "That is what terrifies me. Get some sleep, courier. Tomorrow is the moon ball. You will need your strength." He walked out, leaving Sophie sitting on the counter, flushed, frustrated, and staring at her reflection. "I really need to quit this job," she told the mirror. Chapter 12. The annual moon ball was the social event of the season, which meant it was Sophie's personal nightmare. The grand ballroom was suffocatingly hot, smelled of expensive perfume and suppression charms, and was filled with wolves who looked at her like she was a stain on the upholstery. Because she was staff, she hadn't been given a gown. She was wearing her crisp courier uniform, holding a tray of champagne flutes, weaving through the crowd of silk and velvet. "Champagne? Champagne?" she muttered, dodging a large alpha who was demonstrating his shifting speed on the dance floor. "Get your bubbly here. Try not to spill it on the treaties." She saw Remus across the room. He was sitting on the throne, looking miserable. He was wearing a formal military dress uniform with gold epaulets that made his shoulders look even broader. Lady Vanessa was leaning over him, whispering something in his ear and laughing a laugh that sounded like glass breaking. Sophie felt a stab of jealousy so sharp it almost made her drop the tray. She turned to head back to the kitchen, but a hand grabbed her elbow. "Leaving so soon?" It was Remus. He had moved across the room without her even seeing him. He wasn't looking at the guests. He was looking at her. "I'm working, Your Majesty," Sophie said, trying to pull her arm away. Section 8. Staff must not fraternize with the nobility. "I am the king," Remus said, taking the tray from her hands and shoving it into the chest of a passing duke. "I write the rules, and I say, dance with me." He pulled her onto the floor. The orchestra swirled into a waltz. A hush fell over the room. The Alpha King was dancing with the male girl. "Remus, everyone is staring," Sophie hissed, trying not to step on his polished boots. "Let them stare," he murmured, pulling her flush against him. "Let them see where my loyalty lies." "Your loyalty lies with a woman who smells like envelopes?" "My loyalty," he said, dipping her low, "lies with the woman who fights rogues with office supplies." He spun her back up, and for a moment, the world was perfect. The music, his arms, the look in his eyes, it was a fairy tale. Then, the clock struck midnight. Above the glass dome of the ballroom, the full moon crested the peak of the sky. It hit Sophie like a physical blow. A wave of heat, hotter than fire, exploded in her stomach. She gasped, her back arching violently. The tray of glasses crashed to the floor somewhere in the distance. "Sophie?" Remus's voice was filled with panic. "It hurts!" she screamed, her knees buckling. "Remus, it burns!" She fell to the floor, writhing. Her bones felt like they were melting. Her skin felt too tight. The room was spinning. "She's shifting!" someone shouted. "The latent is shifting!" "Impossible!" Vanessa's voice screeched. "She has no wolf!" Remus was on his knees beside her, his hands hovering. afraid to touch her and cause more pain. "Sophie, look at me. Breathe." "I can't," Sophie cried out as a sickening crack echoed through the silent ballroom. Her shoulder blade had just rearranged itself. "Make it stop!" "Don't fight it," Remus roared, his own eyes flashing gold as his wolf surfaced in sympathy. "Let it break you, Sophie. Let it out." Another crack, then another. Sophie threw her head back and screamed, a sound that started human and ended in a high-pitched, terrifying yelp. The uniform tore. Fur, white as blinding snow, burst through her skin. The pain vanished as quickly as it had arrived, replaced by a surge of sensory input so intense it was dizzying. Sophie wasn't on the floor anymore. She was the floor. No, she was standing on 4 legs. She looked down. Paws. White, fluffy, deadly paws. She blinked. Her vision was sharper, the colors muted, but the movement amplified. She could smell everything. The fear of the crowd, the cheap cologne of the Duke, the rot of a dying flower in a vase across the room. And him. Cedar. Rain. Mate. She looked up. A massive black wolf was standing over her, shielding her from the staring crowd. He was beautiful. He was hers. The black wolf lowered his head and nudged her wet nose with his. A spark of connection slammed into her mind. Sophie? His voice was in her head, clear as a bell. "I have a tail," she thought back, her internal voice sounding panicked but delighted. "Remus, I have a tail, and I have the sudden urge to bite Vanessa." "Focus, my love." Remus's amusement rippled through the bond. "We need to run. The shift energy is too high. If we stay here, we will destroy the ballroom." Sophie looked at the terrified nobles clutching their pearls. She looked at the open balcony doors where the night air was rushing in. "Race you?" she challenged. She didn't wait for a response. She bolted. She was fast, faster than she ever was on 2 legs. She was a streak of white lightning, weaving through the legs of the screaming guests, leaping over the buffet table, snatching a sausage in midair because she was a wolf, not a saint, and crashing through the balcony doors. She hit the garden grass and dug her claws in, the earth flying up behind her. Remus was right beside her, a black shadow matching her pace. They ran. They ran until the palace was a glowing speck behind them. They ran until the city lights faded and the ancient trees of the royal forest swallowed them whole. The run wasn't just exercise, it was a conversation. They moved in perfect synchronization, jumping fallen logs, banking off trees. The bond between them solidified, locking into place like the final piece of a puzzle. It wasn't just friendship or attraction anymore. It was biological imperative. They slowed down in a moonlit clearing, panting, their breath misting in the cool air. Sophie flopped down in the tall grass, rolling onto her back. Remus prowled over her, nuzzling her neck, his teeth grazing the sensitive fur of her throat. "Mine." His voice growled in her mind. "You are finally mine." "I was yours when I threw the mailbox," Sophie projected back, nipping playfully at his ear. "This just makes the paperwork easier." He loomed over her, his golden eyes burning with possessiveness. He didn't need to ask. The moon was high, the heat was consuming them. He claimed her there, under the stars, the ancient rite of the wolves binding their souls together. It wasn't the polite courtship of the court. It was primal, fierce, and absolute. When he bit the mating mark into her shoulder, Sophie didn't feel pain. She felt completed. Hours later, they walked back toward the palace. They had shifted back to human form. Thankfully, Remus had stashed emergency clothes in a hollow tree for situations exactly like this. You have stash trees? Sophie had asked. I have a complicated life, he had replied. They walked hand in hand, the silence comfortable and heavy with their new reality. Sophie touched the fresh bite mark on her neck. It throbbed, a constant reminder of his presence in her mind. So, Sophie said, breaking the silence as the palace gates came into view. I guess I can't quit now. Absolutely not, Remus said, squeezing her hand. You are the queen. The queen cannot resign. Queen. Sophie tested the word. It tasted weird. Does the queen still have to deliver the mail? No, Remus said, stopping at the gate. He turned to her, brushing a leaf out of her wild hair. But she does have to deal with the council. They saw you shift. They saw us leave together. They're going to try to annul it, aren't they? Sophie asked, the bubble of happiness deflating slightly. Because of my bloodline. Because I was latent. They will try, Remus agreed, his face hardening into the alpha mask she knew so well. But they will fail. Because if they try to take you from me now, I won't just throw a mailbox at them. He kissed her forehead, a promise of violence and devotion. I will burn the whole building down. Sophie looked at the palace, then at the man who would burn the world for her. Okay, she said, taking a deep breath. Let's go scream at some old men. Chapter 14. The law is archaic, Conry. It was written when we still thought the earth was flat and that bathing was optional. Remus's voice boomed through the heavy oak doors of the council chamber, loud enough to rattle the portraits of dead ancestors in the hallway where Sophie stood. She was supposed to be waiting for him to finish clearing the air, but the air in the hallway was getting thin. Sophie pressed her ear against the wood, her new wolf senses picking up every vibration. She could hear the scratch of quills, the shuffle of papers, and the smug, oily heartbeat of Councilman Conry. Archaic or not, Your Majesty. Conry's voice was smooth, like poisoned honey. The pureblood statute of 1402 is binding. No wolf of latent blood, regardless of late shifting, may sit upon the obsidian throne. It is for the purity of the line, the stability of the realm. She is my mate, Remus roared. The sound of a fist hitting a table followed, probably breaking it. The bond supersedes the statute. Does it? Conry challenged. If you choose her, you choose abdication. You cannot have both the crown and the commoner. The pack will not accept a queen who spent last week sorting junk mail. They want strength, lineage. Lady Vanessa. Sophie pulled back from the door as if burned. The words echoed in her skull. Abdication. You cannot have both. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling. She had just found her wolf, found her mate, and now she was the anchor dragging him to the bottom of the ocean. Remus was the alpha king. He was born to rule. He loved his pack. If he chose her, he lost everything. I will not listen to this, Remus shouted from inside. The law is clear, but A guard walked by, his heavy boots clanking, drowning out the rest of the sentence. Sophie didn't hear the "don't give a damn" part. She only heard, "The law is clear." He was going to agree with them. He had to. He was the king. A cold, hollow pit opened in Sophie's stomach. She couldn't watch him do it. She couldn't stand there and watch him try to find a polite way to reject her to save his kingdom. She had to make it easy for him. She turned and ran. Not to the wilderness this time, but to the penthouse. She packed her bag in 3 minutes flat. She didn't take the silk uniform. She took her old jeans, her worn-out sneakers, and the stapler. She stood by the bed, looking at the dent in the pillow where his head had rested. Her chest ached so badly, she thought her heart might actually stop beating. She grabbed a piece of palace stationery, heavy, cream-colored cardstock, and a pen. Remus, you once told me I had terrible aim, but excellent delivery. I'm delivering myself out of your life. You're a king. I'm just a courier. Please don't come after me. Let the mail stay lost. Sophie. She placed the note on the pillow. She didn't cry. Crying was for people who had hope. She walked out the service elevator, slipping into the shadows of the city. Just another invisible girl in a big, lonely world. Chapter 15. The apartment smelled like stale ramen and despair. Sophie sat on her lumpy mattress, staring at a water stain on the ceiling that looked suspiciously like a weeping clown. It had been 24 hours. 24 hours since she had walked away from the love of her life. 24 hours since she had become a runaway mate. Her wolf was howling inside her, scratching at her ribs, demanding to go back. He is hurting, the white wolf whined. He is angry. He's better off, Sophie told the empty room, hugging a throw pillow that smelled like dust. He has a kingdom to run. He doesn't need a wife who knows the zip code for every hamlet in the tri-state area. Meanwhile, across the city, the Moonstone Palace was being dismantled from the inside out. Remus stood in the center of the penthouse. The room looked like a hurricane had passed through it, specifically a hurricane named Alpha King Remus. The coffee table was kindling. The sofa was shredded. He held the cream-colored note in a hand that was shaking with a lethal mixture of grief and nuclear rage. Just a courier. She thinks I chose the crown, Remus whispered, his voice sounding like gravel in a blender. She thinks I care about this shiny chair? The elevator doors pinged open. Councilman Conry stepped out, looking smug. Your Majesty, I heard the disturbance. I assume the girl has seen reason and departed. Excellent. Now we can discuss the wedding arrangements with Vanessa. Remus turned slowly. His eyes were not gold. They were black. The void. Conry, Remus said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. Yes, sire? You are fired. Conry blinked. I beg your pardon? You cannot fire the head councilman. I can, Remus said, walking toward him. Because I am the king, and if you are not out of my sight in 3 seconds, I will not be the king. I will be the wolf who ate the head councilman. Conry turned pale and scrambled back into the elevator, hammering the button. Remus turned back to the window, looking out over the city lights. He closed his eyes, extending his senses. He could feel her. A faint, miserable tug on the bond. She was hiding. She was scared. And she thought he was too royal, too high and mighty to want her. He looked at the note again. Please don't come after me. Fine, Remus growled, crumpling the note. I won't come after you as a king. I won't command you to return. He walked to the closet and ripped off his tailored suit jacket, tossing it into the fireplace. He grabbed a set of keys to a vehicle he hadn't driven in years. "If she wants a courier," he muttered, a dark, determined smirk cutting through his misery, "I'll show her exactly what kind of package I can deliver." Chapter 16. Day 3 of Sophie's exile involved a lot of ice cream and a refusal to look out the window. But the window was ignoring her. Thump. Something heavy hit her balcony door. Sophie jumped, dropping her spoon. She lived on the 4th floor. Nothing should be hitting her balcony. She crept to the curtains and peeked out. Lying on her doormat was a side of beef, raw, still wrapped in butcher paper. Attached to it was a note written in elegant royal calligraphy, "For nutrition." "What the?" Sophie muttered. She opened the door, looked around, saw no one, and dragged the meat inside. An hour later, thump. She looked out. A squeaky toy in the shape of a hot dog. It was the size of a toddler. The note, "For enrichment." Sophie bit her lip, trying to suppress the smile that was threatening to break her face. "He's courting me," she whispered. "Like a wolf. He's treating me like a wild wolf." 2 hours later, clang. This time it was a hubcap, a shiny chrome hubcap from a 1960s Cadillac. The note, "Shiny." Sophie laughed. She actually laughed, the sound bubbling up from her chest and cracking the shell of her misery. She walked out onto the balcony, looking down at the street. There was a blacked-out SUV parked across the road. She couldn't see inside, but she could feel him. He was watching her, protecting her, but respecting her space. He wasn't kicking down the door. He was leaving offerings. She went back inside and found one last envelope slid under her front door. It wasn't royal stationery. It was a "Sorry we missed you" slip from the post office. On the back, in Remus's handwriting, "Tracking number 143, mate forever. Status, lost. Reason for delay, recipient is stubborn. Please advise on how to complete delivery." Sophie stared at the note. Her heart did a somersault. He wasn't giving up. He was playing her game. And if he was willing to be this ridiculous, maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the king right now. He was just a male trying to get his girl back. She grabbed a pen. She wrote on the back of the slip, "Delivery requires signature. Sender must appear in person. Uniform required." She slid it back under the door. Sophie waited 10 minutes. She straightened her apartment. She hid the empty ice cream cartons. She checked her hair in the mirror. It was a frizz disaster, but it was her frizz disaster. A knock. Not a thud. A polite, rhythmic rap on the wood. Sophie took a deep breath. Be brave, postal girl. She opened the door. Remus stood in the hallway. Sophie had to bite her knuckle to keep from screaming. He was wearing a postal uniform, but not just any uniform. It was clearly borrowed from a courier much smaller than him. The shorts were scandalously tight around his thighs. The blue shirt was straining so hard across his chest that the buttons were holding on by a thread and a prayer. The sleeves were cutting off circulation to his biceps. He looked ridiculous. He looked edible. And in his arms, he held a mailbox. It was solid gold. It had diamonds encrusted around the slot. It was the most gaudy, expensive thing Sophie had ever seen. "Delivery for Sophie," Remus said, his face deadpan, though his ears were turning pink. "I didn't order a golden mailbox," Sophie said, leaning against the doorframe, her heart pounding a salsa rhythm. "It's a severance package," Remus said. He stepped into the apartment, the golden box glinting under her cheap hallway light. "I resigned." Sophie froze. "You what?" "I abdicated," Remus said casually, setting the heavy box on her rickety table. "I told the council that if I cannot have my mate, I will not be king.
I gave the crown to my cousin. He's an idiot, but he has good teeth."
Remus! Sophie grabbed his arm. "You can't do that. You love the pack."
"I love you,"
he growled, dropping the act. He pulled her into him, the gold mailbox forgotten.
"I don't want a throne if I have to sit on it alone. I want you. I want your bad aim. I want your arguments about postage. I want to spend the rest of my life trying to figure out why you stapled a rogue."
Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "You really quit?"
"I was bluffing,"
Remus admitted, a smirk tugging at his lips. "The council folded the moment I took off the crown. They passed a new law 5 minutes ago. The Sophie rule. It states that the king can marry whoever the hell he wants, provided she doesn't hit him with any more municipal infrastructure." Sophie stared at him. "You liar. You manipulate sexy liar." "Are you going to sign for the package?" Remus asked softly, his forehead resting against hers. "Or do I have to wear these shorts forever? Because they are chafing." Sophie didn't answer with words. She shoved him. Hard. He stumbled back onto the couch, pulling her down with him. She landed on his chest, burying her face in the crook of his neck. "Signed," she whispered. "Sealed. Delivered." Chapter 18. The wedding of the century was held not in the Grand Cathedral, but in the royal gardens, right next to the newly repaired and reinforced drop box. The entire pack was there. The council sat in the front row, looking like they had sucked on lemons, especially Conry, who was nervously eyeing Remus every time the king opened his mouth. Sophie wore white, not just because it was traditional, but because her wolf insisted on matching. She walked down the aisle, which was actually a path of stamped envelopes. Remus's idea. He thought he was hilarious. When she reached the altar, Remus was waiting. He wasn't wearing the tight shorts, thankfully. He was in his full alpha regalia, crown and all. But when he saw her, the king vanished, and only the mate remained. His eyes went liquid gold. The high priest, a wolf older than dirt, cleared his throat. "We are gathered here to join Alpha King Remus and Sophie, the courier, in the eternal bond." He went through the rites. The scent of flowers and joy was overwhelming. "If anyone here has any reason why these two should not be joined," the priest droned, "speak now or forever hold your—" "I might have a letter of complaint," Sophie whispered, loud enough for the microphone to catch. The crowd gasped. Conry looked hopeful. Remus grinned. It was a true smile, wide and blinding, transforming his face. He leaned down, grabbing her waist and dipping her back in front of the entire kingdom. "Howled it," he growled against her lips. "Complaint denied." He kissed her. The crowd erupted. Wolves howled at the sky, and somewhere in the distance, a very confused postal worker wondered why the king had ordered 1,000 pounds of confetti to be dropped from the palace roof. 3 years later. "Drop it," Sophie commanded. "Drop the mail." A small, chubby toddler with messy, dark hair and eyes like molten gold stared up at her. In his mouth, he held a letter from the Prime Minister. He growled, a tiny, high-pitched sound that sounded like a kitten trapped in a blender. "He gets that from you," Remus said, walking into the room. He picked up the boy, deftly extracting the soggy letter. "The refusal to surrender government property." "He ate the electric bill yesterday," Sophie sighed, leaning into her mate. She was currently the head of Royal Logistics, a job she invented that mostly involved telling the council they were inefficient. Remus kissed the top of her head. "We have a delivery." "Oh, no." Sophie groaned. Not another side of beef. Better. Remus walked to the window. Outside in the garden, 2 more pups were playing. They were wrestling over a toy. It was a plastic, red mailbox. Happy anniversary, Courier, Remus whispered. Sophie smiled, watching her pack, her family, her world. She leaned up and bit him gently on the chin. Best delivery ever.